Hey, Bethany, West Seattle, Pastor Megan here, along with Raina. And we get the opportunity to welcome you to our special service this 4th of July weekend as we celebrate our nation's Independence Day. Our service this week, it looks a little different as we're engaging in what's called church as a small group during these holiday weekends. And so we encourage you not to break the habit of gathering with others in fellowship and to worship God on a Sunday morning or whatever day of the week it is that is your worship day. But we want you to be empowered to view it beyond just the building. We're so grateful to be able to gather in our building on Sunday mornings in our beautiful sanctuary. And we recognize that the church is not just about the building, but it's the people, the spaces that we inhabit as we witness Christ's love out and about. And so whether you're joining in for the picnic gathering at Westcrest Park and watching this later, or you're going to be tuning in from a campsite or from home or from grandparents' houses or heaven forbid the car, we hope that you can be blessed in your time of worship and fellowship with Christ and with others this weekend. In this service, we get to hear from our own Abby Odio, an incredibly gifted teacher and mother who, along with her husband Sam and children Mark and Fritz, call Bethany West Seattle home. And so she has an amazing, refreshing message on this concept of home and finding that place within the context of a loving God. And so may you be blessed and be reminded that God is forever coming after you, no matter what you've done, good or bad, whether you're overly religious or broken in a million pieces. God has come down and is seeking after you. And so I hope you have a happy 4th of July weekend, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Stay safe.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's really good to be back with you. I always enjoy being here. Welcome if you're joining us online. Welcome to kids, if there's any of you in the room. We're just thrilled to have you with us this morning. Like Ali said, my name is Abby Odio, and we are heading into just a 2-week mini-series where we're going to be unpacking, kind of dwelling on this idea of home. And it's something actually in our household we've been thinking about a little bit because we're moving this summer, if all goes according to plan. And we've been kind of talking about that. We have 2 young kids. They're 3 and 5 now. And we, brought them on board with this significant life change that they're going to walk through. And I think they sort of understood, but not entirely. And then just this last week, we brought out boxes. And we started putting the boxes together and loading just kind of the preliminary stuff into those boxes. And I think this made it all sort of make a little bit more sense to them. So my 5-year-old, his name's Mark, he just breaks down, like completely breaks down. He is so distraught that he's leaving. And so I kind of let him do the thing where he cries a bit. And then I said, buddy, there's things about moving that make me really sad too. I get it. I do. And I just want to remind you, you're going to be in your same school. You're going to be right next door to your favorite park. You are going to get to, live closer to your cousins. We're literally moving like a mile. It's not a significant move here. But we're talking through it, and he kind of looks up at me. He says, Mom, those are all nice things, but you have to understand this. And I was like, okay, kid, game on. He said, I have one home, and it's right here. There is no other place for me. I was like, great, done. Unpack the boxes, the 2 that we've packed that have like towels in them or something, But this concept of home, it's so compelling to me. And I think if we could somehow reduce our life quest to like a single word, home would resonate for a lot of us. At its best, that word implies a place where I have sort of a holistic sense of safety and belonging and purpose and contribution. This past Tuesday, some of you will know, was International Refugee Day. And a refugee, of course, is a person who has fled their home country due to conflict or persecution. By definition, they are a person without a home. I read an article this week that emphasized the fact that refugees are the most vulnerable people in the world. And we witnessed this vulnerability just over a week ago when a fishing boat carrying 750 desperate people looking for a home sank off the coast of Greece. In our world right now, actually 1 in 74 people are refugees. That's a pretty high percentage if you think about it. That number's doubled since 2014. And their search for a home, it's understandably acute. It's desperate, right? But it's also possible to have the privilege of a physical home, to have citizenship and protections that come with that, but to still be searching, to still be longing for a sense of home. One phrase I've heard used a lot lately is this notion of spiritual homelessness. It's a phrase often applied to folks who have left the church for various reasons, usually citing, disillusionment or politicalization of faith or, being excluded. I connected with a friend recently who identifies with kind of that experience of being spiritually homeless. And as we were talking about her faith, she said, it kind of feels, because she still has a faith, she still is drawn and believes in the person of Jesus. She said, it feels like I'm walking on this bridge, and the bridge that is my faith, it just keeps getting narrower and narrower. And I wonder sometimes, will there be anything left for me to stand on? And as I was considering that notion of home this week, her comment kind of was brewing in the back of my head. So much of our human experience is this quest for home. We are looking for a place, a paradigm, a next step that is utterly reliable. Today we're going to walk through a story Jesus tells, and the central theme of that story is home. And it's probably the greatest story ever told because the concept so resonated with people like you and me who are walking around with that question, where do we find something utterly reliable? And in a world where there's so much upheaval, so much uncertainty, it's a story that offers us a sense of clarity, a sense of hope. So holding that question in mind, what is home? We're going to turn our attention to Luke chapter 15. But as we do that, I'd invite you to pray with me. Father God, we ask this morning that you would lead us home, that you would meet us in a real way, that you would give us a sense of your presence, your consistency, that we would believe the things you say to us in Scripture about who you are and what your posture is towards us, and not just believe them in our heads, but that the felt experience in our souls would be real. God, as we learn, we ask that we would be transformed for the sake of your kingdom, for the sake of this world that you love. Amen. So Luke chapter 15 is going to be our focus, but before we jump into the story itself, it's helpful to locate kind of what is happening for Jesus in the context of his life and ministry. Back in Luke chapter 9, we read that Jesus and his disciples set out on a long journey from the region of Galilee, which is kind of north, and then they're headed south to Jerusalem. And a huge chunk of Luke's gospel takes place on this journey. It's called the travel narrative. And as he went along, Jesus would arrive in a community and he would speak about this new thing that God was doing. He called it the kingdom of God. And he'd invite all kinds of people to follow him, and all different kinds of people did. And his destination is this holy city of Jerusalem. Many of you will know a long time ago, a king named David, king of Israel, established Jerusalem as the capital, as the home, you might say, of God's people. And then a king named Solomon came along and he built a temple there. And the temple was so holy, so sacred, because it was the place where God resided amongst his people. You could say it was the home of God. And the temple had sort of many layers, and the nearer you got to the center, the closer you were to the holy dwelling place of God, which we of course know is called the Holy of Holies. And all sorts of things, your religion, your gender, your age, your piousness, your status within the Jewish priesthood, all of these sort of identifiers determined how far you were allowed to go into the temple, how close you could get to the center, that most holy place, the home of God. So Jesus is on this road trip. I want you to keep all that context in mind. Jesus is on this road trip, headed towards this temple, heading towards the home of God. And we get to Luke 15, where he begins speaking to a crowd. Luke tells us there were tax collectors and sinners around Jesus, and this was something that was pretty common. People who'd kind of been outcast by others were flocking to him. And then sort of back a row, watching all this, we're told are the scribes and the Pharisees. And they're grumbling. I love that word. Like, these are the ornery church folk, right? Like, they're not happy that Jesus is spending time with the sinners. And it's a very diverse audience. It's a very divided audience. If there was a spectrum of holiness, you might imagine that sort of the tax collectors, the sinners are on one end, and then we've got the religious, the Pharisees, who are the interpreters of the law, they're on the other. And to all of them, Jesus tells a story, and he begins like this. He says, a certain man had 2 sons. Now, as the story progresses, we'll see that each son sort of corresponds to one of those groups in the crowd, the sinners and the religious folks. In my family of origin, I'm actually a middle child, and I've always found sibling dynamics really fascinating. I have a younger brother, an older sister, and true to stereotype, the older son in this story, he has it all together, right? He's faithful, he's a little type A, he's responsible, he's always colored inside the lines. He just needs to know what the expectation is, and he'll meet it. That's the older son. And then there's the younger son, and true to form in this story, Jesus tells, well, first of all, youngers, they're just like everybody's favorite, right? For no reason. Like, everyone still thinks my brother's so funny. He's not funny. He's still not funny. He wasn't funny when he was 4. He's not funny now. But everyone laughs. Anyway, that's him. He's also a pastor, and he's wonderful, and all the things too. But younger kids, they tend to be a bit reckless, a bit impulsive, a bit kind of self-centered, life of the party type, right? That's the stereotype, mind you. You'll notice there's no middle child in this story. And I think the real true theological implication is that middle children are sort of the healthiest, most well-adjusted children in the family. They just don't have a place here. And it's in Scripture, so do with that what you will. But as the story starts out, the youngest son comes to the father and asks for something. And notice he does it in a way that's sort of crafty. Some translations say the son asks for his inheritance. But that's not actually an honest translation. The Greek word that we see in verse 12 is ousia, which translates to mean wealth and property. That's what the younger son is asking for. It's actually the only time in the entire Bible that that particular word is used. Now, why would he do this? Well, the reason the younger son chooses that word is because in the ancient world, when a person received an inheritance, it came with things. It came with responsibilities and expectations that you would care for your family, that you would fulfill your role in your community as a leader. The younger son wants none of that. He just wants the money, and he wants it fast. Our older son, Mark, he's been doing a lot of chores around our house lately because he's really into Legos. And we have learned since having children, Legos are like wildly expensive, right? And so he's also learning that as he does his chores. And one afternoon he came in, he was outside weeding, doing some weeding, right? And he just was like, he couldn't have been more dramatic. Like, he runs a little dramatic anyway. And he said to me, Mom, I can't pull the weeds anymore. And I said, well, Bubba, you got to do it. He said, Mom, pulling the weeds is making me slow money, and I want fast money. I was like, my heart started racing. I'm like, Sam, we've done something really wrong. But the younger son in this story is similar. He's after the fast money, right? And I think this is actually a really interesting part. We focus so much on what it is the younger son does when he goes off into the far-off country. We'll get there. But really, the first thing we see him is this indulgence. It's like he's got to have that Amazon same-day delivery, right? He wants it now. He wants it fast. And like all of us, he's looking for home. And for him, he's decided home is not here, home is out there. The place that is utterly reliable is a place of freedom and increased wealth and endless indulgence and using money to meet whatever discomfort arises for me in a moment, even if it means dishonoring his father. And of course, this ask breaks the father's heart. Yet still he honors the younger son's wishes. He divides up his estate. He'll have to liquidate land and assets, and this will take a few days. Some of the assets would actually be sold to other folks in their village, which means word would spread from home to home that the father's great estate was being prematurely divided. And this would be a deeply shameful event for the father. But the father does it, and the younger son takes off. We're told he goes to a distant region. And when the younger son has done here in leaving, it's actually tremendously risky. See, in Jewish custom, if a son sold everything and lost his inheritance amongst the Gentiles, just people who were not Jewish, so that the Gentiles ended up with all the resources that had once belonged to Israel, there was actually a ceremony that would take place to communicate to that person that they no longer belonged to that village. This was like the ultimate cardinal sin. The elders of the community, if that boy tried to return, would meet him at the front gate, and they would take a large clay pot and they would throw that pot to the ground, and it would shatter into pieces, and they would look at that boy and they would say, "This boy is cut off. He is no longer part of this village. He is no longer welcome here. He is kezazah." Kezazah, that's the Hebrew word for cutting off. And these ceremonies actually happened. And it was a way of making it clear to the perpetrator, you have no home here. You're not welcome. You don't belong. And this kezazah is why the next line of this story is bad news for the youngest son who has left, because pretty soon Jesus says his money runs out, as money always does at death, if not before. We're not told how exactly he squandered that money in dissolute living, but it's not hard to imagine. And not only does the younger son's money run out, but it runs out just in time for a famine to arrive in the land. Now, Jesus' original audience, those religious and those sinners listening to this, one thing they had in common was that they knew what a famine meant. Because in that day, a famine was serious business. There was no importing goods, right? There was no Red Cross. No one was coming to help. And these famines, they would tear communities apart. It was one of the worst realities you could face. In desperation, there would be stealing and looting and total upheaval. And as a stranger in a far-off country, the younger son, he was as good as dead. He knows this. But he also knows if he tries to return home, he will face the kezazah. He knows he has no home. So Jesus says the son, utterly desperate, went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. This phrase, hiring oneself out, it's interesting. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this idea. Maybe you've been, in an urban area, a crowded city before, and you're at a stoplight, and someone shows up and they start cleaning your windshield. And they scrub the windshield clean, and just before the light turns green, they open their hands asking for a donation for their unasked for service. In the process, the window washer has sort of glued themselves to you. You haven't hired them, but they have hired themselves out to you. This is what Jesus means when he says the youngest boy hired himself out to a citizen of a far-off country. Now, rarely does someone enjoy being manipulated for pay, and this Gentile citizen is no different. So he offers the boy a job that he knows no self-respecting Jew would take, the job of feeding the pigs, right? Of course, in Jewish tradition, pigs are unclean. In a way, he's mocking this boy. But the boy has no other option. So he takes the job. And you can only imagine that the religious Jews are just sitting back there nodding their heads, right? Like he got what he had coming to him. That's the price you pay when you're disobedient. But Jesus continues with the story, and he comes to what seems like a bit of a hinge point. He says, the younger son is starving, feeding pigs, and then he came to his senses. Another way of translating that phrase would be to say he came to his true self. It's such an interesting phrase. If you're reading the story in Luke 15, this is sort of the first moment of clarity that this younger son seems to have. It's as though he's realizing the thing I thought would be my home, the thing that I thought would be utterly reliable, is actually no home at all. And as a reader, you hear that, and it's kind of easy to side with the Pharisees on this one. Like, what did you think was going to happen? But if we can get past our own self-righteousness, my own self-righteousness, the invitation is not to judge the starving pig feeder. The invitation is to consider, when in my own journey have I made my home in the wrong place? I'm partway through a really great book gifted to me by a friend. It's called The Least of These, and it's about the drugs, fentanyl and meth, and kind of their deadly and tragic surge in America, some of the politics and just awful things around that. But it's written by the journalist Sam Quinones. It's a beautiful book. It's a phenomenal piece of writing. I'd recommend it. Addiction of this nature is not something I've struggled with personally. I have family members who have, but living in Seattle, it felt like an important book to read. And to tell you the truth, when I picked it up, my intention was to learn something about a group of people, but if I'm being completely honest, it was a group of people that felt very other from me, right? And yet, as I read the book, as I was drawn more deeply into the complex stories of these folks struggling with addiction, they did not seem so other. Instead, I've felt a deep connection with their vulnerabilities. I don't know what it's like to be addicted to meth, but I know what it's like to struggle with something and just want relief, to be stuck in pain and be looking for any way out. And I know what it's like to take that vulnerability somewhere that promises me something utterly dependable, and then to sort of find myself stuck in a cycle of disappointment time and time again. Could be work, could be religion, could be a relationship, could be a political affiliation, an addiction, wealth, power, gossip, comparison, consumption. See, if we can identify with the homes we've tried to build to protect ourselves in our vulnerability, like the young son, by simply observing them truthfully, we also have sort of come to our senses. We've come to our truest selves in that moment. There's a Guatemalan poet, Julia Esquivel. He has a lovely poem called "They Have Threatened Us with Resurrection." It's all about hope in the time of war. But the beginning of that poem talks about this whisper of hope that just won't stop. And it's that whisper, I think, that the younger son hears when he comes to his senses. The first lines go like this: it's something within us that doesn't let us sleep, that doesn't let us rest, that won't stop pounding deep inside. In his most vulnerable state, this is essentially the voice that the young boy hears. And he follows it, to his credit, back towards the estate. He gets up and he goes back in the direction of his father. Now, I imagine as he starts on that journey, there are various junctures where he almost turns back, right? Where he almost convinces himself not to do this thing. He knows the Kezaza is coming. He's anxious and dreading it. So he focuses his attention on a speech he'll make to his father. He decides he'll say this: "I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands." He just rehearses that over and over. He's ready to unson himself. It's funny, in our Bibles, this story is often given the title, "The Prodigal Son." But really, the story is not so much about the son as it is about this lovesick father. See, ever since the father had lost his boy, he'd watched the horizon with a small and desperate hope that his boy might one day come home. For days, for months, for years, with all the minutes that have passed since the boy has left, it's fair to ask, what are the odds this father actually saw his boy from a long way off, the way Jesus says happened? But here's the thing about the lovesick father. He never stopped believing his boy would come home, so he never took his eyes off that horizon. This father had watched his youngest son take his first steps, so he knew how his son's shoulders sort of turned as he walked, and he also knew about that little gate that kept his boy favoring his right side. Day and months and years have passed since the father has seen his boys walk, but not another day, not another moment. The father sees the son. Jesus says from a long way off, and he knows it's him. And so the father does this unthinkable thing. Luke tells us the father starts to run. And to be clear, this run, it's not a jog, it's not a trot. It's actually the same word in Greek that's used to describe the foot races that took place in the ancient Olympic Games. This is a sprint. And to sprint, this father would have to pick up the edges of his long robe. He would have to expose his naked legs. And in that world, elders never ran, and they most certainly never sprinted. You might see, children run. You might see someone considered of lesser status run. But elders walked with purpose and poise. They were always in control. But this father sprints because he knows that he must get to that gate before the village elders do. He sprints because he'd rather endure the shame of the village by bearing his legs than have his boy face an even greater shame in the Kezazah. He sprints because no matter how far that boy has gone into the far country, this father never stopped loving his boy, not once. And no matter how far the boy has gone, the boy never stopped needing his father, not once. As the son comes into view, the father sees that he's just a shadow of his former self. He's lost 30 pounds. He's just skin and bones, and his head is down. At the gate, the boy has not looked up. He has not wanted to face the village elders, not wanted to face that word cut off. He's looking down at his father's feet, and the father opens his arms wide, his eyes filled with tears, his belly aches with compassion. The boy nervously begins to recite the speech he's rehearsed. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. But before he can get out the last part, his father puts both of his hands to the son's face and tilts his chin up so the boy is looking right at him. And he embraces him. In all his stench and uncleanliness, he takes it on himself and he covers that son with love. When our first son, Mark, was born, I didn't sleep truly for a few days. I was just so enthralled by this little human and the wonder of it all. And then our second son was born, and I held him for a bit and handed him to his father and said, I'm going to sleep for a couple days. So didn't exactly happen like that, but you get the idea. And I have this memory in the hospital where I kind of woke up and I was sort of in between that sleep and wakefulness thing. And Sam, my husband, was sitting on the little mat they give, the people that are there with you. And he's just holding Fritz, talking to him. Hey, kiddo, we love you so much. I love you so much. Do you know how much we love you? It's so much. And then he started going through our family. You got a papa, he loves you so much. You got a nana, she loves you so much. And I treasure that memory, but this is the way of the lovesick father. And I imagine the father in Jesus' story saying that to the son, saying it over and over, as if he's again welcoming him to new life. You're here, I love you so much. And the father says in verse 24, let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found. See, in that moment, the son is truly home. And he's not even inside the village gate yet, but he's home. And his finding home, it has nothing to do with a physical space. It has everything to do with his relational proximity to the Father, a Father who loves him, a Father who has run to him. There's a billboard close to our house that I drive by almost every day. I drove by it this morning on my way here. And it's a big white billboard, and then in like red and black letters that are kind of intense, it says Jesus. And then below it, it says your only way to God. And then there's a phone number below that you can call. I always wonder where that call goes, Maybe someone knows. Maybe you've done that or called that. Anyway, I picture a phone in an empty room and someone just waiting for it to ring. Anyway, it's probably not how it goes. But I want to call that number. Maybe I will one day. And say, look, I know your intentions are good, and I know you're probably a really good person, but I just got to tell you, I don't like your sign. Because time and time again, the story of the gospel is not Jesus, find your way to God. It's in Jesus, God has found us, right? Jesus, the storyteller, is the Father who runs to us, who became flesh and dwelt among us, whose love chases us down, who says over and over and over and over again, starting in the very first chapter of Exodus with the garden, look, you have a home. I'm giving you a home. You're my children. And if we get that backwards, if we think we are the ones who find God, we miss something so essential. And that brings us to the last bit of this story, which shifts the focus to the older son. The father throws the younger son a party to celebrate his return, and not everyone is happy. Jesus says now his elder son was in the field working. And as he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has got him back safe and sound. Then he became angry and refused to go in. So the father finds him outside and tries to convince him to join the celebration. And the older brother says, listen, for all these years I've been working like a slave for you. I've never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. See, the older brother's story is so remarkable because by including it, Jesus makes it clear that it's possible to stay, to do all the right things, to grit it out and to work and to still not be home. The older brother also has mistaken the utterly reliable thing in his life. He thinks it's his good choices, his work ethic, his obedience. All these things have made him worthy of his father's attention. You could say the older brother feels as though he has found God on his own. His actions have earned him good standing. This is the home he's made for himself. And while outwardly it appears less offensive than the younger brother, it's deeply problematic. For one, the brother's emphasis on his own self-righteous behavior, his own work, has caused him to lose touch with the father's love. Simply put, he doesn't think he needs it. He does not have to rely on it. The late author Flannery O'Connor has this great line in her novel called Wise Blood. She writes this of one of her characters. She said, there was a deep, black, wordless conviction in him that the way to avoid Jesus was to avoid sin. See, this is the older brother's way. He's not living in the father's love because he's lost touch with the reality that he who has done it all right would need such a thing. It's offensive to even suggest it. And is so often the case, there are tragic ramifications. The older brother is not only disconnected relationally from his father, but also from his younger brother. See, I have a feeling the older brother was actually hoping there would be a cutting off ceremony. Was actually hoping that he might be the one that got to drop the pot and watch the look on his brother's face fall as it shattered. Why? Because if there are no consequences for the younger brother, what good is all the work the older brother has done? He cannot live in such a love-loaded, grace-loaded world without becoming jealous and judgmental and angry and afraid. Simply put, he's not home. The theologian Miroslav Volf writes, the older son has unsunned himself. Now watch what Jesus does here with his story. It's just masterful. The father notices his older son is missing from the celebration. He goes to find him the same way he ran to find his younger son. And standing outside the party, the older son lectures his father. He goes on a little rant using the word you instead of father, right? He won't even call him father. This language is subtle, but it's important. It indicates there's this distance between the father and his older son. But when the father addresses his older son, notice the very first words out of his mouth are this. He says, my son, right? He affirms their connection. You are always with me. and everything I have is yours, but we had to celebrate and be glad. This brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. See, with that one phrase, the father refuses to let the older son unson himself. He affirms his love, his connection to his oldest boy. He brings him home, so to speak. And then he refuses to let his son break relationship with the younger son. He reminds him, this brother of yours has returned. He's your brother. Because when we are truly at home in the Father's love, when we find that utterly reliable thing, we will not be so quick to judge others, to cut them off, because our sense of wholeness is not dependent on others being kept out. We don't have to be threatened by them. We're free. And at this point in the story, the religious leaders listening to Jesus, they're just kind of squirming in their seats, right? Didn't see that one coming. Remember, Jesus tells this story on his long trip to Jerusalem, that sacred home of God's people, where the temple stood, that home of God. And yet with his presence and his words, Jesus is redefining how people understand home. It's a beautiful thing. It's not about a place or a destination. It's not about where you fall on that spectrum of sinner to utterly religious. It's not about your proximity. It's about your proximity to God's love. And by the way, God's presence is no longer confined to a temple, a single place where only the most holy can enter. Nope. God's presence is right here before you in this person, Jesus, who has run to us. That's the whole point of the good news. And friends, this is where it gets pretty simple. It's not our actions that will qualify or disqualify us to come home. It's simply a question of humility. Can we receive into our story Jesus' love? Pastor Phil led the staff this morning in just this really profound reflection about how hard it must have been for that young son to step into that party, right? Everyone in that village knew what had happened. Like, way to go, dude. You're back after just being a complete train wreck. We're so glad. Here's the calf, the roast. But he does it. He goes, he receives. He has the humility to say, I did it wrong. I made my home in the wrong place. Can we do that? Maybe you're in a far off country right now. It's an addiction no one sees. And by the way, we're all addicted to something. You're not alone. It's a season of squandering, of void hope. You feel like you have no one to turn to. It's a secret you're carrying and you can't imagine a way forward. Here's the good news. Jesus says there's a way home. Maybe you've been in church for years, but you've never felt loved for who you are and all your beauty and complexity. Love has always seemed to come with conditions. And so for some reason, this is especially true when you're at church. There's a home for you in Jesus' love, period. Maybe you hear the story of the older brother and you don't want it to be you. You really don't. But if you're honest, gosh, you identify with his bitterness and his judgment. It all feels justified, right? Those crazy Seattle liberals are at it again. Goodness, rein them in. Or those Christian conservatives, what are they doing? Stop. I get it. Here's the thing, we cannot build our homes there. And when we try, we miss it. We miss the good news. We miss the party the same way the older brother missed it. There's a better way, Jesus says. There's a home for you. And of course, we must note that work is not bad. In fact, work belongs in the home. Obedience is not bad. That has a place too. Indulgence is not bad. There were moments Jesus indulged. It has the place in the home. But if we go there, if we try to build a home there, we will end up like both brothers, lost. As the band comes up to close us, I just invite you today to sit kind of honestly with that question. Are you home today? Are you home? I think a little Mark saying that's with all the defiance in the world, I'm not moving. This is the only home for me. He's moving, to be clear. But my sincere hope for our church is that we could locate our stories in the love of Jesus and just pitch our tents there. Say, this is the only home for us. And from that place of security, from that utterly reliable place, then we join in Jesus' journey. Loving people courageously, willing their good, embodying justice, welcoming others home. That's the call. Talk a little bit more about that next week. But it starts by finding the right home. And that's the invitation to all of us today. Let's pray together. I'm just mindful of those women who found the tomb in Mark's gospel and were afraid and ran the other way. I'm just thinking right now about the Father seeing the Son and just running right at him. I feel like those two pictures are just so often who I am, who we are. Running from your goodness, setting up home in other places. God, I pray that you would just find us this morning with your love, that would not just be that would not just be kind of an old Sunday school song, but that it would be a real thing for us. We would know it, that we would experience it in just precisely the way we need to understand, to get a glimpse of it in all of its glory. You are the Father who runs. And it landed you on the cross. That's the craziest part of the story. You went to Jerusalem. You said, there's nothing I won't do. And even there, your life, your light won. God, we're so grateful that you have swept us up into that story. That we receive light and courage and goodness because you were unafraid to take it all on yourself. God, take us to that home. Take Bethany to that home. May we just be a big group of partying people that others just can't help but stay away from. There's so much hard in this world. Your love is so good.